What you call me?
Man, I ain't Poe.
Today's film commentary will be about the film Nickel Boys, released in 2024 with a rating of PG-13 and a runtime of 2 hours and 20 minutes. The director is RaMell Ross.
So, disclaimer. This film focuses heavily on the black male perspective, and thus, as the viewer, we are intimately intertwined in that reality. But this film was adapted from Colson Whitehead's fictionalized novel titled The Nickel Boys. The author has stated that the novel is a fictionalized account of the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys in Florida. The school that was open for over 100 plus years, was segregated for most of the years it was operating, and known for abuse beyond what you could even imagine. Years later, many victims spoke out about the horrors that they endured at that school, and unmarked graves were discovered on the property, which started an official investigation. So please be aware that if you decide to watch this film after listening to my review, that it's heavy. And you should be aware of what to expect, as this is the point of my reviews. Also, if you haven't got it already, I always have spoilers in my reviews, because if I'm going to talk about a film, I don't want to talk in circles. I want to talk about it. So if you feel like this isn't for you, then maybe come back for another review. But I will try to pinpoint more of the approach of the director and how the film felt. And I just wanted to add that disclaimer because of how heavy it felt, anxiety-inducing it felt, often depressing while watching the film. But films like these need to be made not only for people's stories to be heard, but because they do pinpoint a really terrible, nightmarish time in our history. Now, again, this film focuses on a fictionalized account of what took place at this reform school. This is an adaptation of Whitehead's novel, but the perspective that he has chosen to focus on, as well as our director, is the black perspective. Their school historically and factually did have white male students, and black male students, but there were other accounts, and we do see the other students existing, but you can see a clear distinction in how they were treated. So the perspective approach, we are the characters. So Elwood is the main character, or at least one of the main characters that we start our journey with, and we are with him from childhood to his teenage years. We very rarely see him, and when we do, it's usually a reflection and for a very short time, at least in the first half of the film, which has a more graceful, nostalgic feeling to it. And I think a lot of that is because that's how childhood can feel. Now, I won't say that there isn't ever any anxiety, especially when Elwood, our main character, is in his teens, as he is more, and when you're a black person, you're often more perceived as an adult, even though you're still a child. It is an actual thing that's been studied. And so you can imagine in this timeline, him, there's some scenes of anxiety when he's, I guess, outside leaving from work or whatever he's doing, studying, and you can hear the real fear, feel his fear, just going home, and it's a little dark, and at this point he's a teenager. And there's a specific scene where there's an older white man kind of poking his cane at his belly, and some other black teenage boys around him. They all look pretty young, almost as if they're animals, as if they're not human beings with emotions and feelings. And we don't really have a lot of context, but I think and for that specific situation, but I think the context is racism. Racism knows no bounds. Racism has no real reasoning. It's hate, fueled by hate, fueled by hate. So I pinpoint this because I feel like the intent of the perspective really makes you feel grounded, tangible. It brings forth more empathy. We are him. And I feel like this could easily have turned into something that felt like a weird video game. that was more robotic and weird and it didn't work, but it did work. It worked. It didn't feel distant. It didn't feel robotic. It felt even more connecting than you already probably would with a main character that you're presented with, especially as you're growing with him. And you can tell that Elwood is smart. I'd say book smart. He has a Nana that loves him. I don't really know the background behind his parents, but I don't care really as a viewer because you can tell that he is loved and cared for greatly by his Nana. She brings sort of the sunshine, the positivity, even in the worst of times. And you really see her sort of rally behind Elwood through this whole film. And her shine does sort of go away later in the film, but for the most part, she truly is a fighter. And Elwood, I think, is better because of it. I would say that Elwood, basically, before all this happens, that he was living as normal as a life as you could at that time, being a black teenage boy during the civil rights era. So, yeah. And you could really see that his peace was with his Nana and his childhood home that he grew up in, and the vibrant colors and the playfulness and the careful kindness that comes with those memories as he reflects on them later and in that moment when we're with him growing. It's very beautiful. Okay, so basically the way that we end up going from that beautiful nostalgic childhood and we're thrown into the reform school is when Elwood is on his way to this technical college. It looks like he's walking, but it's kind of far, and he ends up taking a ride with another black man who offers to give him a lift, and it's basically being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They get pulled over by a police officer, and there's some other context as to what happens, but basically Elle shouldn't have gotten the car, which obviously he was a kid and he didn't do anything wrong, but it wasn't as if the cops were going to do this full investigation to prove that he didn't. He was a black boy and they don't care. Okay, and his Nana tried to get him a lawyer and stood up for him, and either way, he became, I guess, what's called a nickel boy, which is sort of the name you're given when you're sent to this reform school. And you can almost immediately see the distinct difference in the way that he is treated as a black boy versus the other white boys immediately. Their clothing, where they're staying, the buildings are very different. It's bad. This isn't to say that there was no abuse or anything happening to the white boys. There definitely was. Factually in history, there are witness accounts of white male students bringing this up. But like I said before, we're focusing more on the black perspective. But, you know, there was a clear distinction in the segregation and the quality of life, which I think is something that has been noted all throughout history with education, normal education, so on and so forth. And by the way, the college that Elwood was walking to was a technical college, and there was some sort of trial where he wasn't going to have to pay for education in the fall. So it was something that you could see throughout the film that he was really interested in after his teacher brought it up. And so sort of having not only that not happen for him and for it to drastically change to this is heartbreaking. Okay, so the other main character's name is Turner. He doesn't seem to have much of a childhood, or at least not a good one. He has stated himself that he knows that his mom loved him, but that she loved alcohol more. He's just as smart as Elwood, and they do end up creating a friendship, and they do really seem to trust each other and take each other's advice, so on and so forth. And Turner seems to be a lot more street smart, a lot more aware of his surroundings. I think that they balance each other out in a way, but they also both are very headstrong, and once they have their mind set on something, it seems that that's what they do, especially Elwood. And you'll see what's going on in the school, how the boys are treated, basically like less than human, a lot of labor intensive work for most of the boys, basically not being able to communicate with their families very often, if at all. I think there's one scene where they get letters, but the families are often denied access to coming and visiting the boys. It's very sad. And again, I feel like throughout the film, I had this feeling of anxiety, this weight on my shoulder, fear of something bad happening because of the social climate and the political climate, but also just because of where they are. They aren't safe. They aren't protected. There's a moment much later in the film, where the one time that they all get treated pretty good equally is when they have this inspection at the school. So again, like putting up airs that, we're fixing troubled youth. Really, they're abusing them and exploiting them for labor and doing a lot of behind the scenes shit that's fucking wild. Like, it just feels like a nightmare. And then when the officials are coming in to check stuff, then the kids are getting good food and they're all getting good clothes and all that shit. It drives me nuts. And so it's clear that they can provide it, they're just choosing not to, which really makes me angry. I can only imagine how the parents felt. It's heavy. I could feel myself being like, yeah, this is something that I think that I could only watch maybe once every now and then. Now, I think that something that, again, brings the story into a sort of experimental, dedicated film is, of course, the camera work. We never change out of that perspective. It's always either Turner's perspective or Elwood's perspective, and it's Elle's perspective through a lot of the film. And we see them a lot more because we change perspective. So before we didn't see Elle very much at all, but then we'll be in Turner's sort of perspective, his body, looking at Elle. And that we see Elle so much more now because his best friend is seeing him, or he's seeing his best friend, and that's our perspective. And this perspective and this viewing of their world, even in the harshest, terrible of circumstances, is still so realistic. And I don't know if it's the color palettes of the cinematography, but it just feels so cinematic all throughout the film. And then we're obviously trying to understand the characters, and we get some, not perspectives, but we do see what's going on with the other boys and the things they're going through, and the real fear of death and physical, emotional, maybe even sexual abuse. We also see that some of the boys there are very, very young. They look like they could be 8, and then the range is maybe like late teens. I really do think that doing some research into the real story and learning about how some of the boys ended up there, although I'm sure it's just not having certain access and just not being well off, things like that, I'm sure. And knowing when you aged out, they spoke about possibly aging out. There's 3 ways out of this place, and none of them are gonna be your lawyer getting you out, which is a whole thing. We see Elle's struggle with his Nana and the lawyer throughout the whole film, and his time and his life just passing. And there are moments of the film sort of showing us clips of older films with Sidney Poitier, a really well-known Black actor in America at the time, who was honestly doing a lot of things that a lot of Black male men were not able to do in the Hollywood industry. A very well-known actor. We see clips of that. We see clips of what's going on with civil rights. We see that Elle really looks up to Martin Luther King Jr. a lot, and he reads a lot. There's references to a lot of literature. And sort of in those moments, it feels like a documentary. And then we also see futuristic clips a lot later in the film of someone who's clearly reflecting on their trauma, who seems to be one of our main characters, but we're not aware of who it is yet. And that sort of keeps the ambiguity of how is this gonna end. And I won't say anything about the ending because I feel like as much as I don't mind spoilers because I like to talk about the film, I feel like it's something that has to be seen and experienced to understand how terrible and heavy it really was. And the sort of twist that's at the end as well is something that I think you need to watch. It's a film experience that I won't forget and probably won't watch often as it weighed on me, but it's a must watch. I hope that the victims get justice and the families of the victims as well. Thank you for listening. Bye.